I'm Allison Jonjak, the Cranberry Outreach Specialist with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. These videos are the on-demand recordings of UW Extension and the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association's virtual brown bag lunch series. These monthly sessions offer growers and researchers a way to share timely and relevant information. We hope you'll enjoy and continue to engage with us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Grant Holly. I'm the Executive Director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. We are very happy to be able to partner with UW Extension to bring you the research needed to be able to navigate our ever-changing environment. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for their valuable time and leadership, the growers for joining us, and Allison for being the catalyst from which all of these sessions rely. Thank you so much.
I am recording. If you have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can put a question in the chat. I will be watching the chat and I can ask those questions to the presenter. If you'd like to ask a question anonymously, use the drop down and say ask a question to Allison Jonjak, and I will ask that question anonymously on your behalf. Today, I'll go ahead and jump into our agenda. We're going to flip the order here, and hopefully Dr. Shinya Ikeda will be able to go first and talk about an introduction to him, his work, his goals here. Then we'll have Dave Jones giving us some field updates, the senior ag scientist at Ocean Spray. And then finally, I will give an overview of how to use the EPA Bulletins Live 2 website. But before we do that, I have been expecting to see Tom logging in, but I know Tom has a lot on his plate this week. And so in an absence of Tom at this particular moment, I will take the initiative to introduce Grant Holly to you. Dr. Grant Holly, who is the incoming executive director of the Wisconsin State Cranberry Growers Association. So give us your welcome.
Welcome. How's everybody doing? I'm super excited to be able to be here today. I'm at the research station. I've been here with a number of your leaders already, and I got to say that it's just one of the most healthy and happy communities I've ever been a part of. And thank you. This is day 5 of me being on the job, and I'm still learning as we go. But please reach out, and hopefully we'll all talk soon.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're extremely glad to be able to have. Grant it's been a fantastic 5 days. We're looking forward to the next many more.
It has. It's been a busy 5 days. It's yeah, cranberries are popping everywhere.
Awesome. So thank you, and look forward to seeing more of Grant in future. I assume we'll have introductions for the grower community and everything, but wanted to take the moment, since we were all here in one place, say hello. I will go ahead and will unmute Dave. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue to have questions on up to the end of the session. Dave, are you wanting to share your own screen, or were you wanting to have me share mine? I have your slides ready for you if you want.
Yeah, I'm going to have you share them, Allison. Unfortunately, both Sarah's laptop and my laptop decided this morning that they need a Zoom update that only our regional cooperative IT guy can handle. So,
oh, what fun.
No computer for me.
All right. I am real grateful to be able to have a highly functional laptop that can do the image portion. So I will mute myself. Thank you, Dave, for joining us to give us and I asked, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, hey, Dave, are you able to do this? Do you have a title yet? And he says, that's probably going to be something based on what happens that week. So looking forward to hearing what happened this week.
Sure. Thanks so much, Allison. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to the growing season. I'm going to be uncomfortably close to my little phone screen here while I give my slides. So I guess you'll get to enjoy a close-up of me while I give this talk here, but we'll make it happen. Today, the topics that I'm going to go through in order, we're going to talk a little bit about late winter and early spring weather trends. So specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about how we got here, a little bit about our early loss of ice and how that's impacted the early going this season. We're going to talk a little bit about bud development trends statewide, both in northern and central Wisconsin. I did want to hit on winter injury. Unfortunately, this has been a topic of increasing interest and importance in the last couple of weeks, and I think will continue to be over the course of this season. I'd also wanted to talk about the hail that we had in central Wisconsin last week. Obviously, the rumor mill in Cranberry works quick. Most people are aware of this already, but I just wanted to spend a little bit of time discussing the implications here. And then we'll finish with some insect development comments. Next slide, please. All right, so I could talk about a lot of different components of the weather trend for the year, but the one that I really wanted to hit on this year is the loss of ice in central Wisconsin in late February and early March. I think of all of the things to talk about in the early going here, this is probably the most impactful for a couple of reasons. Northern Wisconsin fared a lot better, as they so often do these days in these early springs. They were able to hang on to that ice into mid to late March, which obviously we all know is a huge advantage. Unfortunately, in central Wisconsin, because of this early ice loss, although it was on average warmer in April and March for that matter, there were several spells where conditions were seasonably cold. And because we'd lost that ice, we basically had two choices: either flood them up or try to ride it out and hope that the vines were cold hardy enough to survive. Most growers, the average marsh in central Wisconsin, opted for a lot of flooding. Most folks, by the time all was said and done, were on their fifth flood by mid-end of April. So it was a lot. Cumulatively, if you look at how long a lot of these marshes were underwater, you're looking at 3 to 4 weeks. Now, I want to be really clear, that wasn't contiguous weeks per se, but if you tally up the time spent underwater across, in many cases, what was 5 full floods, in a lot of marshes, it was up to 3 to 4 weeks. And I think that this is important to call out, not only when we talk about winter injury in a little bit, but when we talk about vine development. So it has been warmer than average the last 6 to 7 weeks. However, vines spent a lot of April underwater, most of March underwater, or at least a good chunk of it. And so although we are tracking ahead right now, it's more like days as opposed to weeks. As I look at pictures that were taken in the same regions on the same day in my archives between this year and last year, they are a little ahead. But it's probably more like 5 to 7 days ahead as opposed to multiple weeks ahead. And a lot of marshes actually aren't even that far ahead compared to normal. Northern Wisconsin, I would say, looks a little bit more normal in this regard. Next slide, please. All right, so talking about bud development, starting with Stevens, this is always an interesting week when you do bud development because we always have a huge span of bud development stages depending on the area, even within central Wisconsin. So some of the slower developing areas, typically we see this in Plainfield, parts of Black River Falls being good examples. Stevens is at bud break, and some of the buds are even still looking a little bit like late cabbage head, but mostly bud break, if not a little further along. But warmer areas, looking at Cranmore, but definitely Warren's Toma area, more like bud break and early elongation at a lot of sites, depending on how warm they are. So Stevens always has a lot of variability right now. Up in the north, Stevens is mostly at bud break at this point in time. Next slide, please. There we go. All right. Modern hybrids, as we always expect, are ahead compared to everything else. Now, we kind of lump modern hybrids all together because they typically are just faster than Stevens, but within modern hybrids, there's certainly differences in the pace at which they'll move in the first half of May, first 2-3 weeks of May. D. Moranville is a good example of one that always seems to get out to a bit of an early jump. So this is a picture of D. Moranvilles that Sarah took down in Warrens, I think yesterday. You can see they are really looking in more like early roughneck in a lot of those cases, at the very least, pretty elongated buds. Mullica Queen, this is a shot taken from Cranmore the other day, mostly elongation with a little bit of early roughneck out there in some spots. It depends, but most modern hybrids right now are ranging somewhere between elongation and early roughneck in central Wisconsin. In northern Wisconsin, you're looking more like bud elongation. So they are in front of Stevens up north as well, but not nearly as progressed as we compare to particularly warmer parts of the central area. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to flip over and talk a little bit about winter injury now. So this is damage that is associated with the cold, drying weather after the ice was lost in late February or early March. And there are a couple of main cold windows that are likely to blame. There was one in the first week of March where we had 30, 40 mile an hour winds and high single digits in a lot of areas of the state, which was a particularly nasty one. And there was another one around March 15th, which yielded similar conditions. So most of the damage out there right now, we believe, is probably linked to one of these two events, just looking at where the damage seems to have been most prevalent. There are actually two types of damage that we're seeing out here right now. So the first type of damage is the type of damage we're seeing on marshes that simply didn't flood during one of these major cold events. And I'll kind of mix some distinctions as to what these two types look like on the next slide. The second type of damage that we're seeing, and I would say probably the more common one, is damage on vines from a raking flood, or essentially a flood that didn't cover the vines fully. Now, there are a few reasons that growers may not have been able to put the vines fully underwater here, ranging from decision not to high crowned beds or lack of water in general. But these are the two types of damage that we're seeing that we'll look at the next slide. Obviously, everyone wants to know about scale. This is a hard one to assess right now because it is still so early in the game, and it's also wildly variable. It ranges from very extensive at a handful of marshes to totally absent at a lot of marshes, and there's some in between as well. So this is a true mixed bag across the region. There's really not a single comment that can be made other than it's out there. There's a good amount of it at some places. We're going to have to just monitor it in the next 2-3 weeks as we move in towards bloom. Obviously, we all understand this will have an impact on the state crop. I would say the true impact is unclear, but we are aware of it. I think we will just kind of have to wait and see how vines come through, especially as we start moving into that bloom window. Next slide, please. All right, so talking about the two types of winter injury that we're seeing right now, this first slide is dedicated to winter injury at marshes that did not opt to flood for one of those key cold windows. And the pattern in these situations is pretty much that you're looking at vines that have been killed right to the ground. So it's often found in pockets where ice would have been lost first. Some of the marshes that opted not to flood did so, especially in early March, because they still had partial ice coverage, maybe 70, 80%. And they knew that if they put water out, they'd lose the rest of the ice, and they were hoping to maybe hang on to it. So where this is present, I would say it's often found in pockets where the ice would have come off early. And it's manifests itself as vines that are essentially cooked right down to the ground. So you can see in the leftmost picture, especially, you're looking at brown leaves all the way down to the soil line. In these cases, we're probably going to see these vines sprouting actually directly up from the ground, or probably low, very low on those uprights due to the level of injury. The right-hand picture is what a lot of this looked like several weeks ago, kind of more of a salt and pepper look. But as the vines tried to come out of dormancy, more of what we're seeing is now just this full brown look all the way to the ground. Next slide, please. All right, so this is the damage that is more common, I would say, based on what we're seeing right now. And this is damage associated with vines that were poking out of water, either because the grower opted for a raking flood or because they simply weren't able to get the vines underwater entirely. Like I mentioned, there are a lot of reasons that vines aren't able to be put under, depending on the marsh. Sometimes growers were short on water. This was common out in Plainfield in particular, where reservoirs were getting real low after last year. Other times growers actually did opt to put a raking flood on. And the other one that's really common is crowned beds. So beds with a really high crowned middle. It's hard to get some of those beds fully underwater without a pretty incredible amount of effort. And so you often get kind of a ridge of vines right down the center of a bed that's poking up. In these cases, the distinction between this type of damage and what I was showing you on the previous slide is that basically everything above where the water was is fried, just like you saw in the last slide. But everything below that point is actually still green and alive. And that's why you can kind of, I think in both these pictures, you can kind of get a sense of that. It's just the tips, essentially, of these vines that are cooked, as opposed to the entire vine. Now, the good news is I think vines that are experiencing this type of injury are going to recover a lot faster than the vines that got hit right down to the ground. The bad news is that these sections still lost most of the crop, because as we all know, the fruit bud is in the terminal part of the vine, and anything that was sticking out was probably terminals, which is where the fruit bud would have been. So there's probably going to be a little fruit in some of these patches, just because there are uprights that do sit a little bit lower in the canopy that will have some fruit buds, but you're going to be looking at pretty severe reduction in crop in a lot of these patches that are burnt. So there's kind of the two main types we're seeing. And like I said, I would say the tip burn is the more common of the two, though, again, it depends on the property that you're at. Next slide, please. All right, so flipping over to talk a little about the hail that we had in central Wisconsin. This hail rolled in the evening on May 7th, around 6 o'clock, and it was very concentrated around Warrens proper. There were a couple of things that made this cell a little bit unusual from my perspective. I mean, I think the first one was how concentrated the hailstorm stayed for the entire time that it was dropping intense hail. This time of year when we get hail, or really throughout the growing season, what we're probably more used to seeing is a system that travels really fast across a geographical region and throws hail at a lot of isolated locations. That's the more common way we see these go. So it's spotty, but typically the storm moves across the region relatively quickly. This cell was odd because it just hung over Warrens. So once it popped up, it just sat over Warrens proper for most of the duration that it was dropping heavy hail. It's so much so that a lot of us were relatively nearby when this happened. Like I talked to a couple of growers that were at a track meet in Toma when this stuff was coming down, and it wasn't even raining down there. So same thing in parts of Cranmore, Plainfield. As a result, I would say in general, you're looking at a handful of marshes being severely impacted, with most of the rest of growers looking at more incidental damage in like that 5 to 10% range. The other thing that made this cell unusual was the period of time that hail fell on a single area. So there were some marshes at the epicenter that saw hail for as long as 23 to 25 minutes, contiguous minutes, which is also really rare. I've only seen hail fall with that kind of duration one other time in my career, and it wasn't in Cranberry. So when hail falls for that long, obviously, we're expecting serious damage on those beds. A handful of the beds that were most severely impacted had as much as 3 inches of hail accumulation in them. So that's a lot of hail. I do want to emphasize, though, this is not the majority of marshes in the area, in the Warrens area. This is a handful of, really a handful of beds where it's the worst. And then most of the Warrens area looks fine, probably more in like that 5 to 10% range. So certainly, we took a hit as a state because of this cell, but I think as opposed to a regional wipeout, this was really more an unlucky few that got it really bad, and then the majority who got more what I would call incidental hail. All right, next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to move over to the IPM update here, and I'm going to, this is going to be fairly brief. Next slide, please. Reason being, this week is essentially what I'm going to call the calm before the storm. Talking to the other IPM providers in central Wisconsin, we kind of all on the same page, talking to particularly Pam and Suzanne. I think all of our groups saw more or less the same thing this week, which is that while there were certainly insect pests out there this week, they were both very small in number and also very small in size. And I think this is interesting because I think with the heat and slight progression of the vines relative to what we might call normal, I think there was certainly curiosity as to whether the insects would follow suit and be out in force much earlier. I would say so far, obviously, you know, it's still early going. We have another 10 to 14 days before the traditional onset of the first spray of the year for that pre-bloom window. It's not looking like that's going to be the case this year. Although the vines are slightly progressed, it doesn't really seem like the insects have necessarily followed suit. It's very common around that May 15th mark to find your first scattered hatch of green spanworm, rennick looper, some of our early cutworms, all in very small size ranges. And that's exactly what we found this week. I know that one group did find a tiny little sparg, a singular tiny sparg. We actually did not see any sparg in our nets this week, nor did we see fireworm. I fully expect we'll probably start seeing them next week. However, if we look at the forecast, you know, kind of peering into the crystal ball, next week is looking relatively cool. So we're going to have a hot weekend. It's going to be really toasty tomorrow and a little bit warm on Sunday. But then next week, our daily highs are going to be in the 60s, which is not unpleasant, but it's certainly not hot. Insects are ectotherms. They tend to track with, especially in the spring, like this time of year, they tend to move quick when it's very, very hot. They tend to move at a little bit more measured pace when it's a little bit cooler. So based on what we're seeing right now, I personally suspect it's unlikely we're going to see a lot of these pests hit economic threshold for at least another 10, maybe even 14 days. I could be totally wrong. We'll see what next week brings, but I think based on our current pest progression trends, it's probable that we're probably looking at more like 10 to 14 days before the average central Wisconsin marsh were to hit any kind of real economic threshold for pests. So right now, I would say the very earliest insecticides for the pre-bloom window would probably go out maybe second half, like tail end of next week, but I'm suspicious that the majority of growers are probably lining off more like early the following week at the rate we're going right now. The other thing that we saw a lot of this week, and I have it circled in red there, is the little yellow globose springtails. You can see it in that top middle picture there. I emphasize these every year this time of year because they look very similar to the naked eye to the pest on the left, which is a blunt-nosed leafhopper nymph. Fortunately, we've not seen any blunt-nosed leafhopper nymphs yet this year in our nets. This is about the time we would expect these things to start coming out. So obviously all of the major scouting groups are going to have their eyes peeled for these, but I will say that they've become pretty rare to find in central Wisconsin, actually across the state, thanks to rigorous management practices by all of you in the last several years. So good on all of you for that. Allison, could you flip to the previous slide once, actually? Thank you. The reason I mention these is that if you look at real close at that picture, these little yellow globo springtails essentially look like little flecks of yellow dust, and it's very similar in appearance to the naked eye to what you might expect when you're worried about looking for a small blunt-nosed leafhopper nymph. We saw a lot of yellow springtails this week and no blunt-nosed leafhopper. So just a friendly reminder that if you do swing a net out there and you see a bunch of little yellow insects scuttling around at the bottom of your net, it's probably springtails, but if you have any questions or doubts about that, whoever you use for an IPM provider would be able to sort you out. And of course, I'm always available for this as well. Next slide, please. All right, that is about all I've got. I think I'm right about at my time. I did want to give a special shout out to all the IPM consultants, particularly Pam and Suzanne, who I chat with often during the season. It's really helpful to get their perspective and help us kind of keep tabs on what's happening across the region. And with that, I'm happy to open it up and answer any questions if there are any.
We do have a couple of minutes for questions. If you want to unmute yourself and ask, or if anyone wants to ask a question in the chat, also happy to take a question for Dr. Ikeda if you have any. But thank you for the thorough update, kind of ice off through present day, Dave, and we're very appreciative, and we'll be keeping our eyes peeled for more.
Absolutely.
I am surprised at a lack of questions so far. So I'm imagining that once I start the paperwork based part of the slideshow that everyone's going to come in with a lot of questions and hopefully bring us back into growing conditions. But until we have those questions come in, thanks, Dave, and also Pam, Suzanne, and Sarah for your contributions to that as well. So awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome. I guess I don't need to take extra minutes if people are feeling quiet.